Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for following me on to this workshop. I'm Rob Hopkins. Very involved with the transition movement, and I recently wrote this book about imagination. And so this workshop is how to build a time machine, which is where I want to give you one or two tools that you might find useful in the work that you do. So I have here, just out of shot, the time machine that I actually have been building during lockdown. I found some plans on the internet and I built it using stuff I had in my garage. And what I want to do is to attempt the first act of collective time travel in the history of the Oxford Real Farming Conference. So this is a pretty seminal historic moment that you are that you are here today for. So this is an exercise that I've done with really small groups of people and with really large groups of people, and it's something which I hope you might find useful. So the invitation is for you to get yourself comfortable, and for you to close your eyes and to take a breath. And in a moment, I'm going to turn on my time machine. And when we turn on the time machine, what we're going to do is we are going to travel forward from 2021 forward to 2030. And the time that we travel through, the years that we travel through, have been a time of the most profound and extraordinary change and shift, which in 2021 felt almost unimaginable, but we could just glimpse different pieces of it and what it might be like. But what happened in the subsequent years was that there was a cascade of positive change. It wasn't all easy, but things started to move and things started to shift. And it was a time that people who came afterwards looked back to as an extraordinary time in history, as a revolution of the imagination. They sing great songs and tell great stories about the incredible work that people did during that time. So when we turn on the time machine, I'd like you to imagine that you are kind of lifted up from 2021 and then gently drop down into a 2030, which is not utopia. It's not perfect, but it is the result of everything that could possibly have been done being done. And when I turn on the time machine, you'll hear some sounds that will help you with that. And when we get there, we're just going to sit for 2.5 minutes and just allow yourself to go for a walk in your imagination around that space. What does it smell like? What does it feel like? What do you see? What do you hear? How does it feel qualitatively different from where you've come from? Okay, so I'm now going to turn on my time machine, and we will take 2 minutes in silence just to go for a walk around that world of the future. Can you hear that? Sorry. Okay, so if I might just invite you back again, and what's going to happen now is James is going to pop you into a breakout room, and I don't know how many people we are, so how many it'll be, but it'll be a few people, and just take a minute each to just share any of the key reflections, key observations, key things that you felt or saw or experienced, and we'll just have a sharing of how that experience was for you, and then we'll see you back here in 6 minutes or something like that. Okay? How was it for you? What did you see or hear, or what was your experience?
Well, it was great. I mean, something's been very much on my mind anyway. I live in a very small rural parish in Wiltshire, and there's no heart to the place. It's a kind of dispersed sort of settlement, and so been thinking of how we can get people actually feel connected to the place rather than just living there, because we're surrounded by farms and agriculture. So yeah, the vision really was a lot more community sharing of things like lawnmowers, those sorts of things. The roads were a lot quieter. There's more people walking around. There's allotments along the roadsides. A lot more bird song. A lot more sort of wildflowers. It was sunny. It's always sunny in the future, isn't it? And yeah, just a lot. There was no need to travel out so much. There was more work, people were working from home. There was a sort of sense that there was a lot more activity within the place rather than just being a sort of commuting area. So yeah, it was good, very positive.
Thank you. Is there anybody else here who's not in a group who would like to share anything? You're muted, I think.
Go ahead, Rod.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, it was sort of really interesting sort of going around the village and really seeing a lot more vegetables being grown instead of just sheep and cows. And I think that's a really important thing that I can see in the future. And a lot less vehicles, really not so much not all the transport that carries on, but much more people staying in the village as community. That was the sort of key thing that really came across for me.
Thank you. Yeah.
The song made me remember the organism, insects, and then the worms. They are very happy enjoying the land's good ecology atmosphere. Yeah, it really brings me colorful and warm feeling about the farmland. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure. I think are we bringing people back in a minute, James?
Unmute. I'll bring everyone back now, okay?
Great, thank you.
Okay, it's going to close in a minute.
Hey, Sam, nice to see you there.
Rob, can I ask a quick question while people come back in?
Yes.
Do you find there's a big difference between age groups as well? You talked about a commonality of vision, but is there, young people, do they share similar ones to older people in your experience?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'll talk about it in a minute, but there are sometimes, I don't know, is everybody back? Are we all back? James? Yeah, okay. Well, welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for doing that. It would just be really nice if we could take a couple of minutes just to, if you wanted to use the chat, if there were 3 words that kind of captured what it was that you saw and what it was that you experienced, what would they be? And let's just use the chat just for a minute, just to have a bit of a shower of impressions and sensations that you had. So fun to meet new people. Trees, fruit orchards, urban green optimism. God, it goes by very quick, doesn't it, when there's so many people? I think at the end of this, though, we can download the chat and read slightly at more leisure. Hobbiton. homemade cargo bikes, veg instead of sheep, no cars, more time, more social. I couldn't even read that. Community connection, abundance, quiet, trees, birds, children's rights, from noise to peaceful, a much less polluted atmosphere. Home, gentleness, empathy, walking through the land. Home, beauty of nature. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for doing that exercise. And just to give you a bit of background, lack of silos between farming and forestry. Fantastic. So yeah, I've been doing this with groups for a couple of years now on lots of different scales, as I mentioned, in small groups and in big groups. And there are different ways that you can facilitate it. So in a smaller group, I often do it where I get people to line up facing towards me and they close their eyes. And then the way that you transition from now into the future, you need something that kind of marks that transition. So in a big group, I do it where people take a physical step and people close their eyes and I say, okay, now step into 2030. And then they physically step forward and then just stand there for a few minutes and just sort of, and it can be very powerful, very moving. Often there are tears when people take that step. It can be quite an amazing thing. In a bigger group, like in a theater or in a big venue, clearly you can't get everybody to stand up and step forward. It would be a health and safety disaster. So the way I do it then is I get everybody to hum at the same time. I say, you all come here wondering what a time machine sounds like. It sounds like this. And I go, with you all joining in, and you get this beautiful kind of chorus of humming. And then it's lovely because then it fades away and then everybody sits there in that sort of stillness for 2 minutes. It's really nice. And then doing it online, as I've been having to do over the last year or so, I've had to then, so that sound that I played at the beginning is a kind of a soundscape that I developed with a sound artist, friend of mine, which if anybody wants to get hold of that and to use in events that you do yourself, you're very welcome to just drop me a line. I'll put my email address at the end and you can get in touch and I can send you that file. It's a really, it's just our attempt. I'm sure you'll come up with much better ways of trying to do it, but finding ways to mark that shift. And when you do that exercise, so I always then do it where, like we did in the chat, but in the room. So to hear from people what they saw, what they experienced, and it's a beautiful thing to do actually. One of the things that you can also do if you do it in a group, so when I run it in a workshop, is that you do that exercise and then you can put people into smaller groups to then think about other aspects of that. So you might then say to them, okay, so get into groups and have a think about what were the policies that were put in place in 2021 which accelerated our journey towards that. And you don't need to, by the way, if you're taking notes, you don't need to write all these questions down. I've just put a link in the chat there to a little guide that we created in Transition Network, which includes all of these questions. But so you might also say, what are the values that underpin the world that we've imagined for 2030? What job are you doing? What's your role in that future? What are you doing every day when you get up? What does the economy look like? And then again, you start to find that common ground of actually how does that work together? What were the projects and the movements in 2021 that inspired and informed this shift? What were the key sources of, actually I can't even read my own handwriting. What were the key sources of inspiration that people had at that time? What changes were made to the education system in 2021 that really accelerated this? What support was given to people? What changed? How were people more able to do it? Are there any tools or devices that you have in 2030 that didn't exist in 2021? What are the new things that you've got around you? And yeah, and so also you might think about, well, what are the, we used to do some quite fun workshops at the beginning of Transition Town Totnes of saying, okay, write some newspaper articles from 2030, write the small ads out of the local newspaper. What are people buying and selling? Post the kind of lonely hearts columns, you know, like where people are looking for love. What are they looking for in a partner by 2030? And those kind of things are really good fun. And Charlotte just asked, how do you create an atmosphere where people feel comfortable engaging in an exercise like this? I think one of the things that I do with that is to start by putting people into a slightly more playful space. So actually that exercise that we did, those of you who came to the talk that I did before this, that exercise I did at the beginning with the helmet, where I said, okay, you've got 2 minutes to think of as many different uses as possible. That's a really nice kind of an icebreaker. And I always get people to get into pairs to do that exercise, and to get into a pair with somebody they didn't know before they came. And I usually frame it along the lines of, you know, this is an event about community, and you know, we live in an epidemic of loneliness, and we recognize that we're going to be much healthier if we know more people. And so by the end of tonight, you're going to know at least 2 people you didn't know before you came here. And then you put people into a pair with someone they didn't know. They do the exercise with the helmet, which is kind of silly. There's no right answers. It gets them out of that school thing of being like, oh no, I've got to think of the right answer. It's like, there are no right answers here. You just can come up with absolutely anything you like. And that starts to, I think it's, if people get put into a pair with somebody they already knew, they find it easier to grumble that this is all a bit silly and all a bit ridiculous, and I'm far too sensible for this kind of thing. If they're in a pair with somebody they didn't know, and they're first given a couple of ice-breaking things to just warm them up a little bit, that really helps. One of my favorite things that I would do in a bigger group, in a workshop, is my favorite activity like that, which is called potato monsters, where you put people into groups of 4 and you give them 4 potatoes and some cocktail sticks, and you say, you've got 20 minutes and I want you back here with a monster, and you can go out of here and you can add to it anything you can find, but I want to know its name, I want to know what it eats, and I want to know its mating call. And then they all go off for 20 minutes and they just giggle for 20 minutes. It's wonderful. And they come back with these ridiculous things. And it just starts to get people out of that kind of, oh, I don't want to make myself silly. I don't want to, you know, it starts to bring that kind of play culture. And then when I do that exercise, again, I ask people to, before I do it, I ask them to find their partner, who is somebody who they didn't know before they came, and to turn their seats if they can, so they're kind of facing that person. And then they do the exercise, and then I always say at the end, keeping your eyes closed, just lean into that person and just describe to them what you saw and what you felt. And again, there's something about when you do it with someone you didn't know, that you find it, that you're much less likely to go, oh, this is all ridiculous. And I've only had one time I did it in Stroud, I think it was, and there were 2 people who got the giggles because it was just slightly too silly for them. But it only lasted for about 5 seconds, and then they kind of got on with it, really. Yeah, and so that's kind of what works for me. And I think as well, there's just the thing of having the courage to try it. You know, that was the big first step for me. I was like, oh, I'm going to propose this, and everyone's going to be like, they're just going to mess around and they're not going to do it. And as well, it is like, there's something about making it quite theatrical and quite you know. So I always do a thing where I say, okay, so the sound of the time machine is this. It's everyone going and everyone goes and I say, no, that's rubbish. That's far too quiet, and that's never gonna work as a time machine. Let's try it again, much louder, and everyone gets really into it. And it's like almost like choir practice. You know, you're kind of conducting people in this thing, and then somehow when they've done this big loud hum that they've all participated in, they kind of again feel a bit more ownership of it and a bit more kind of committed to it somehow, I suppose. So the more you can make it like a piece of shared theatre, which is why, you know, I always have that thing about, well, I built my time machine and it's over here and you can't quite see it, but I bought it with me and I had to bring it here on the Eurostar, and I had so many questions about it at customs, and you know, so the more you can do to make it quite playful and silly, I think really helps. So that's that exercise, and I hope it's something you might find useful. And that link that I put in there has some more some more information about it and how you might find it to be useful. Does anybody have any questions about that before I move on and do the other thing that I wanted to do with you in this session? If you had any questions about doing that particular exercise. Okay. Yeah, so Matthew says it sounds like it is the same that got us excited and involved as children. So it seems like we've forgotten how to have fun at times. Absolutely, and that's you know, I've one of the things when I studied improv, when I was researching the book and I went to do an improv training, the first thing that you did was that the guy who was teaching it talked about how important it is to get out of that adult mindset of having to be right all the time and being afraid to take risks. And so we had to walk around the room reciting over and over again in as many different ways as possible, I suck and I love to fail. And it was fundamental to everything that came afterwards in the workshop. I suck and I love to fail. And I think there's that building in that sense of, I don't mind, you know, what's the worst that can happen is I'm going to look a bit daft. You know, is that really so bad? How do we build this kind of thing into our life more regularly? I think, you know, often I've done this exercise and people have said, you know, this, I'm going to take this away and do this almost like a daily practice. It'll become like my kind of daily meditation practice, just sort of dipping into the future and just sort of just kind of keeping that flavor of it. So there's absolutely no reason why you can only do this exercise in a hall full of people. You can do it wherever you like. And it's one of the things that for me, there's a kind of a variation of it that I developed when I was teaching permaculture that I used to call permaculture tour guides, where you would take a group of people to a particular place, somewhere in a town, and you would have a meeting place and put them into groups and say, okay, we're going to meet back here in half an hour. And I want you to design a that you are tour guides in the future in 2030, and this place is now the best example of permaculture in the whole world, and people come here from all over the world to see this. Well, actually they come from within the country because there's no flying by then very much, so they come to visit this place, and you are the tour guides, and find a route from here that will take like a 5-minute tour, and then take us on that tour and explain it to us. So you're walking just down a normal street, normal houses, and they're saying, look, and over here you can see this amazing garden that was built here, and you can see the espalier trees up against the wall, and the rainwater harvesting that happens over here. That's another really nice kind of example of that. Yeah. So I think, what was it, Jane just said something. There's so many things here. I have been the only woman in a room of male farmers. That alone made some of them feel uncomfortable. Yeah, you know, I'm not saying that this is necessarily the easiest thing to do in all circumstances, but I've it's one of those things where I always feel like the things that feel really tricky often turn out to be the most rewarding things to have done. And I always would do this exercise thinking someone is going to just bugger this up for me and sort of undermine it. And actually, the only time I did it a while ago, and I said to the audience afterwards, so does anybody have anything they'd like to share? And one woman said, well, when I got there, all I could see was darkness. I think she was, you know, trying to be like, well, you know, we don't have a future. There is no future. Everything's screwed and it's all too late. And all I could see was darkness. And I thought, okay, well, this is going to really bum out the whole conversation. So I said, well, maybe you arrived at night. And then everybody thought that was quite entertaining. And then we moved on to other people's things. But usually people really get into it. So I'm just going to share my screen again because I wanted to share with you a few more things which hopefully you might find useful. And also just to say in the pod, no, I'm not doing that. I'm going to this. Yeah. And those of you who were in the workshop will have heard the little sound file that I played of people's voices. And in the podcast that I do, from what if to what next, which there's an episode every 2 weeks, and we explore a different what if question. And every episode, we start with that exercise in effect. If our, and I'll put a link in at the end for people who are interested in getting involved with that. So whatever our what if question is, if it was, what if a universal basic income sparked a revolution of the imagination, then we do that exercise and say, okay, it's 2030. We've had a universal basic income for 8 years. What's it like? Walk us around it. And it allows us to get away from just debating the policy itself and really into what would it be like? And what would it be like to live in a world where birdsong drowned out the traffic? What would it be like to live in a world where we had relocalized the food systems? And there's a special edition on there where I cut all of those bits together. It's like an hour of people's, I'm seeing this, I hear that, and it's beautiful. It's really, really moving. So I just wanted to share something with you for the rest, for a little bit now, which is another tool alongside the time machine, which I find really, really useful, which is the ability to ask a really good what if question. This was when I was writing the book. I went to the youth climate strike in Exeter, near where I live, and this was one of the banners that was there. I thought it was just fantastic. And the ability to ask a really good what if question, I feel, is one of the great skills that we really need to be cultivating. And so what is a good what if question? When I was researching the book, I spoke to Ruth Ben-Tovim, who's an incredible community arts practitioner. And I said to her, what makes a good what if question? She said, the first thing is the people asking it have to be genuinely curious, because the people that you're asking will have an instinctive understanding if the question is coming from a genuine place of curiosity and openness or not. The second is that it must be a question that can be answered in many different ways. It ignites a possibility of response from many different angles and a trust that the responses will be accepted. And thirdly, it should offer a sideways look at something that triggers a moment of pause, like lifting a curtain, she told me, a glimpse of something you can step into. And Tanas Mokas, who was this incredible mayor of Bogota in Colombia, who was a great believer that play and politics should go together, he gave my favorite definition of a good what if question when he said, what people love most is when you write on the blackboard a risky first half of a sentence and then recognize their freedom to write the other half. So I've just wanted to share a couple of my favorite what if stories from transition movement. This is in London, Tooting, where transition town Tooting in South London came up with a what if question where they realized that in their neighborhood there was nowhere that was like a town square, a village green, a kind of people's space. They said there's one place it could be, which is here, which is a bus turning circle. This space is normally full of buses waiting to be called to go somewhere. They normally keep their engine running. The air quality is awful. And so for one day, they organized an event. They called it the Tooting Twirl. They raised £2,000 in a crowdfunder. And for that one day, they turned that space into what it would be like if it was a village green. All the buses went away. It cost £35 a bus to make the buses go away. And the buses went away for a day. And they filled that space with conversation, coffee, flowers, color, carnival. They put real grass down onto the bus turning circle. So I could sit there on a Saturday afternoon in July in Tooting with my feet on the green grass of Tooting and really imagine that space as if it actually were a village green. And what was most fascinating for me, I was there all day from setup to take down, was that the conversations shifted. At the beginning, I heard people saying, well, if this was our village green, da 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 da. By the end of the day, people were saying, when this is our village green, da 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 da, something deep under our feet in the tectonic plates of possibility started to shift. I heard people looking at the wall of Primark, which, if there was a competition for London's dullest wall, it would definitely be in the top 3, I think. And normally nobody would ever even look at this wall. And I heard all the conversations of people saying, when this is our village green, what are we going to paint on that wall? What story of this place do we want to paint on that wall? What do we want to celebrate on that wall? There's something about when you ask a really good what if question, it can change the sense of what's possible. And those of you who were in the workshop earlier will have heard me tell the story of Centre Alimentaire in Liège in Belgium, which for me is one of the most phenomenal examples of they came up with such a brilliant question. What if in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in Liège came from the land closest to Liège? And that question sparked a transformation of how that city is working in relation to food. 25 new cooperatives, 5 million euros of community investment, incredible amount of support from the mayor and the municipality, a reimagining of how universities, schools and hospitals supply the food, but starting with a really good what if question, and then just opening that space and holding that space. And it's one of the things that we don't really have time to do here, but in longer workshops that we then go into spaces to really think about what makes a good what if question. And I've loved, of creating new what if questions. One of the things I've loved during lockdown and during the time of COVID has been to see the number of communities who have been inspired by the book and have been using what if as the framing for how they talk about where they want to go next. This is a project in Derry and Garva in Northern Ireland who are using what if as the framing for reimagining where they go next. Transition Bude in Cornwall did a month where they all read the book together, and then every day they would come up with a different what if question, and someone would make a beautiful graphic, what if graphic, which captured the what if questions that were coming up in their group. And I thought these were so beautiful. What if car parks became play parks? What if birdsong drowned out the traffic? What if our verges were full of wildflowers? And one of my favorite ones was, what if there was a daily imagination lesson? And they posted one of these a day, every day for a month. And then the final one I just thought was so beautiful, because by then people were used to the format and the what if and the what if, and they didn't need to even put the whole what if in, but they had an image actually, which, like when you did that exercise, you didn't leap straight to thinking, oh great, I've got a bigger TV. Actually, what that exercise does is it allows you to step into what it is that brings us contentment and happiness in a deeper thing, rather than kind of short-term pleasure, which capitalism so thrives on marketing to us. And this was the last image that they put up, which is about community, conviviality, connection, quiet. I just thought it was such a beautiful kind of image to close that season with. And in Sweden, the Green Party in Sweden ran an advertising campaign in elections where they just used images of things that already exist in the place and just put what if over the top. This is one example. Again, this is one which takes us beyond solar panels and organic carrots and into the idea that, you know, what if we actually could create a world where people did have time and space to go for a walk in the forest with their kids, and that somehow didn't feel like a luxury. And again, it's sort of touching into those questions around conviviality and connection. This one I thought was just beautiful in terms of giving a sense of our urban spaces and how they might be transformed. And I just wanted to wrap this bit up just with a little story. Before the lockdown, just before the lockdown, you remember when we could go places on trains? And I went to Austria, to Germany, near Munich. And I was invited there by Patagonia, the clothing company, who were always talked about as being one of the world's most sustainable companies. And they do a lot that is amazing in that regard. And they give a lot of money to good campaigns and so on. But they were realizing as an organization that they weren't really acting at all as if this was a climate and ecological emergency. They were kind of coasting a bit on the sustainable thing, but were they really acting as if this was a climate and ecological emergency? And how differently would they act if that was the case? So I went and I did a workshop with them one evening, and I got them playing and being silly and telling stories of different things around the world. And then the next morning, we did this exercise that we called the Walk of What If. And in the Walk of What If, we put people into groups of 6, and they went for a walk. And the overarching question was, what if in everything that it did, Patagonia acted as if this was a climate and ecological emergency? They had an hour to go for a walk. I said, think of as many what if questions as you can. Write them down, make a note of them, but just brainstorm. But there are 2 rules. The first rule is that don't be constrained by what already exists. So don't be thinking, yeah, but that's not in our last 5-year plan, or that'll never fit with our budget for blah, blah, blah. Just really allow your imagination to run. The second is, nobody is allowed to say yes, but when someone makes a suggestion. Yes, but is banned. You can only respond to a what if question by saying yes and. And as I mentioned in the talk, the beautiful thing with yes and is, which I learned from improvisation, is when somebody makes a suggestion, you say yes and, and you build off each other's answers, and you end up with something way, way more than the original spark. It also means you kind of trusting each other and going where the other person wants it to go. And they went out for a walk for an hour, and they came back almost in a kind of altered state of consciousness. It was with sheaves of questions, what if questions. It was really quite extraordinary, and I got them to then write all of their what if questions down on pieces of paper, and then I said, okay, imagine that end of the room is really, really, really urgent, and that end of the room is not really quite so urgent. Arrange in conversation with each other your what if questions along this continuum, and then we ended up at the one end of the room with all the questions that were the most urgent ones, and we gathered around those. And I said, if there are questions here that you feel really drawn to facilitating a conversation around how this might become a reality, then just pick it up and hold it above your head, and everyone else who wants to join you will join you. We ended up with 6 groups. After about 2 hours, we had 2 ideas that could be implemented across the organization the next day. But there was the thing that I came away with most was that sense of really getting a taste of when you create a good yes and culture in a group, and what it can unlock in terms of what if questions. And really, it's all of this has really given me a kind of a new lens to look at the transition movement through. You can look at the transition movement as being many things: an economic development process, a community development set of tools, or whatever. I think in many ways, one of the things that it does is it creates and holds good what if spaces. And if we don't do it, who does it? Where in 2021 are those spaces held where people can come together in a yes and kind of a space and really explore what if? And so many of the projects as well in transition really give people a taste of what that future could be like. The future you imagined in 2030, how can you start a project now that brings it alive on whatever scale, small scale, big scale? I remember visiting that food market I mentioned in Crystal Palace, and I said, why do you do this? And they said, because we want our children to grow up thinking that this is normal. And that feels to me like such a big aim of a lot of this. So as I said at the end of the last thing, if you want to find out anything else about this work, robhopkins.net is where all of the interviews that I did for the book, you can find them all there. If you read the book and you think, oh, that person was interesting, you'll find the whole interview with them there. Transitionnetwork.org, there's a transition near me function where you can put in your address and it'll tell you what's happening near where you are. We have a great thing coming up in March, which is going to be called the What Next Summit, which if you just keep an eye out, you'll see some stuff around that coming up. And the podcast that I do, Rob Hopkins, is From What If to What Next, which is really good fun. We had Brian Eno on it last week. He was fantastic. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And we have 10 minutes if anybody has any questions, or you might like to put a hand up and you can ask your question yourself, or any reflections or anything that you would like to share in this last 10 minutes that we have together. And Nick is already here, and you could, as Nick is doing here, if there are what if questions that are coming into your imagination after all of this, do share them here. Maybe if you want to ask a question, you could put it in, put your name or something, or do the thing where you press the hand up button.
Rob, I just sent you a link to a list of questions that I've been copying from the chat room, if you want to have a look at that. And then obviously we can take questions from people who want to say them out loud.
Great. I've just seen my friend Angie is here as well. Hi, Angie. When you know a lot about a particular subject, you often know the very serious problems in that area that others don't necessarily know on the surface, i.e. NHS environmental science, etc. How to move past that and get your imagination going. That is a very good question. I think, you know, and with any of these questions, you know, there are people on this call who have as much, if not a lot more experience of me of these things. So do put your reflections on these questions in as well. I think, I mean, my sense of that in workshops I've done before is that it kind of, if you create enough opportunities for people to be speaking with each other, then that stuff is kind of worked through. And actually, often people, when I've done workshops with, when you bring in the yes and thing rather than the yes but thing, often people who you're talking about find that really liberating, because they themselves can often feel kind of stuck in that sense of, well, we've always done it like this and we did it like that once and it didn't really work. It's like, well, okay, we're going to create a space where we can just kind of suspend disbelief for a little while and just imagine that that might actually be possible. Yeah. Do you have any techniques to help people open their mind, put aside their biases? I find sometimes that when doing these exercises, people just revert to the thing they campaign for or are comfortable with. Any games or exercises to help with this? Yeah, that's kind of what I was saying before about that I find that. So the 2030 part of it isn't by accident. The 2030 part of it is because if you say 2090 or 2080, it all just gets a bit ridiculous. And so it's so many people really get very quickly into dystopia when you do that. And 2030, the result of 2030, that is the result of us doing everything we possibly could, can be interpreted kind of in different ways, I think. And it does, stepping into the future does, I think, mean that people often step more widely than what their campaigning thing is. That's kind of my experience anyway from doing this. Which leads on to someone says, do you have suggestions for helping people who have a very negative view of the future? For example, that we're heading towards collapse and extinction. Yeah, I do this exercise quite a lot in Belgium and France, where there's this very strong collapsology movement, who are a bit like sort of deep adaptation and Jem Bendel and all that stuff. That's like everything is now inevitably about to collapse, and there are some people who can't do this, but way less than you'd imagine, actually. And I find it really interesting that for me, it leads into a really interesting conversation about why create a political philosophy that results in people being unable to imagine anything other than total disaster. It becomes a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that there is that, you know, I'm a massive admirer of Joanna Macy, who I think is just fantastic, and she does incredible work around these things. But I saw recently she did a workshop where she does this very powerful activity where you meet somebody who has come from the future and they ask you a question. And so the first question was something like, you do it in pairs, and it was something like, you had to reflect on, when I think about the inevitable collapse of civilization, I feel, which is fair enough. It's an entirely likely scenario. And then something like, when I think about the inevitable collapse of the biosphere, I feel. And I think, yeah, and it's really powerful and really important work. But I did think, where is the one that goes, when I think about being part of the most phenomenal joined up historic movement that led to profound societal, economic and cultural change, I feel. It always feels like the bit that's kind of missing, and that exercise for me can be really good at kind of tapping into. What if we set up citizens' assemblies for towns and parish councils? Absolutely. What if all local councils had to do this type of workshop? That would be very nice. What's the worst thing that has happened when you've done something like this? Well, like I said, I did that one in Stroud where some people got the giggles, but actually everybody else was so in the zone of doing that exercise, that it didn't spread. It didn't kind of become infectious. Yeah, I can't think. It's one of those things, as I've said before, that at the beginning I thought, there are so many things that can go wrong, and we so easily convince ourselves not to do things because of all the things that could go wrong. But actually, every time I've done it, people actually find it quite a profound thing to do, and it puts them into a headspace. I remember doing it once with some climate activists in France, and one of them said to me, "I'm just realizing I've been doing this work for 20 years, and I've never done this. I've never stopped to really imagine the kind of world that I want to create." And I think that's kind of common for a lot of people. Maybe just one last one. Maybe I'll pop back to the Zoom and see if there's anything. Do people pay for these sessions? It depends. There's different ways that they happen, I guess, in different contexts. And Joanna Macy's work saved my life as an activist. Yeah, me too. She's phenomenal, and one of the really great, one of the really phenomenal characters in this whole world, I think. Yeah, so I think we're coming up to the end of our time. Actually, I don't know if I don't know.
Rob, if I can just tell you that Dixie over here's got her hand up.
Oh, Dixie,
Can you take a question?
yeah.
Thanks. Yes, I do loads of Zoom sessions, so I'm used to the putting your hand up and waiting to your asked to speak. So my question was going to be about how you deal with those yes but responses, but you have talked about that, Rob. And I think what I've got from this session is really lots of really helpful ideas about how to work with groups in a way, and how to be an enabler. And I think it's really interesting that lots of the questions are about, what do you do with people who are negative or resistant and all of that kind of thing. And I think that as a facilitator, your positivity, Rob, is it's quite hard to be relentlessly negative with someone who is kind of open and accepting and hopeful, really. And so I think one of the answers to that is to bring yourself to it in a way, and don't deny that negativity. But I think farmers probably can make monsters out of potatoes and have some fun quite effectively if you give them the space to do that. And the other thing is that, I guess if we can take those big ideas and then get people to think about what could they do in something much smaller, so what could they work on? What could they work on to affect change? And then it becomes, instead of changing the whole world, they're changing one aspect of their community, and that's the beginning of big change.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's I've known lots of farmers who would love nothing more than to make silly monsters out of potatoes. It's one of the most gloriously daft ways to start doing anything, and because the beauty of it is, even if you were really somebody who was completely obsessed with doing everything and not making yourself look ridiculous, it's impossible to make anything out of potatoes and cocktail sticks that doesn't look completely ridiculous. So it allows you, it puts you into a kind of more childlike play kind of space, I think. Have I ever done imagination workshops with children? How different was that? Not really. There was I remember being in Belgium with Transition Belgium, who organised an open space for kids about the future. And one of the questions in it was, what do you think you should be taught in school that you're not taught in school at the moment? And my favorite answer to that was disobedience, which I love the idea that it's 10 o'clock, time for disobedience class. No, sod off, we're not going. Well done, very good, a gold star. yeah, but I'd love to do. Yeah, I mean, all this stuff works with everybody, and you just tailor it for who you're working with, really. I think we are at time, actually. Sadly, it would be so much fun if we could have just done this for another 2 or 3 hours and done lots of other silly games and exercises. And I kind of like collecting daft exercises like this. But we've kind of run out of time, I think. So thank you so much, and it's been wonderful to be able to bring some of these things to the Oxford Real Farming Conference, and enjoy the rest of it.
Rob, you were going to give your email address.
Oh, I was going to give my email address, yes.
Sorry to butt in.
How do I do that? Everyone. Yeah, and hopefully all of this soon will lift, and we will be able to meet in person next year, or whenever it is, and we can do silly imagining things together, and then go for a drink afterwards, and it will happen. So thank you all so much for coming. Enjoy the rest, and enjoy the rest of your conference.